June 5th, 2010. That is a night that many across northwest Ohio and southeast Michigan will never forget. A generational tornado outbreak struck much of northwest Ohio, including a historic EF4 twister that reached peak intensity near Millbury. And in addition to that Lake Township tornado, we're going to be talking about all of the tornado damage that occurred across northwest Ohio and lower Michigan late that evening and on that night. If you're watching on WTOL 11 Plus, YouTube, or social media, I'd love to hear in the comments below. How will you remember that, and how are you personally impacted? And if you have any photos to share from the aftermath of those tornadoes, we'd love to see those on social media as well. So we're going to break down not only the science behind this tornado outbreak, but also the tangible impacts that affected so many lives across northwest Ohio and southeastern Michigan. Now, I want to start off with a slideshow showing photos of the damage and the aftermath of these tornadoes. And these photos are shared from the National Weather Service Cleveland office, many of them occurring during the storm surveys that followed in the days after those tornado touchdowns. Now, this twister touched down as an EF0 in Wood County in east of Perrysburg. It was near the intersection of I-80 and Oregon Road, and this happened late in the evening at 11:20 p.m. Now, this historic tornado that culminated in EF4 intensity was on the ground for approximately 10 minutes, so touchdown at 11:20. You can see the tree damage is the most notable there, close to that site of initial touchdown as an EF0 twister. It reached EF1 intensity near Moline in the Indian Hills subdivision. Once you start to get to an EF1 tornado, you can incur damage to rooftops and siding of homes. So you can see that here. This was again from the National Weather Service Cleveland during some of the storm surveys that occurred in the aftermath of these devastating twisters. Subsequently, this tornado ramped up to an EF3, a strong tornado touching down at the Lake Township Police Station as a supercell thunderstorm continued its journey from west to east, and you can see cars were turned and toppled, and that is characteristic of EF3 damage. Now, as we head towards Lake High School, EF3, this is one of the biggest impacts that was felt with this twister. Sadly, Lake High School was demolished, and I know personally this is something that hit very close to home when I was still a high school student watching all of this damage unfold. Now, it was near peak strength at this point, a high-end EF3, but it wasn't totally at its peak strength at that point. And there was actually a brief weakening. This is characteristic of many tornadoes. They ebb and flow in intensity. It's not a totally linear relationship. So after hitting Lake High School, there was a brief weakening to an EF2, and this is near Collins Road and Pemberville Road. You can still see some substantial structural damage as well as tree damage from those storm survey photos from the National Weather Service Cleveland. So what did the damage look like at peak intensity? Of course, Millbury was devastated by this EF4 twister. Cars were thrown around and toppled. Buildings were totally demolished, and you can see the rubble there. The day after the tornado touchdown, the sky was blue, the sun was out, and first responders were on the site surveying the aftermath that ensued. So let's talk a little bit about the science or the meteorology behind this weather setup. It was a very potent storm setup. Now, as you may recall from that day, there were some rounds of thunderstorms that happened earlier in the day in the morning. Some of those thunderstorms left what we call outflow boundaries in the atmosphere, or small little boundaries that did enable some wind shear or turning in the atmosphere. It was a stormy weather setup south and east of an area of low pressure. Oftentimes it is southeast of the low, where you have winds coming in from the southeast and you have a lot of turning in the atmosphere or wind shear. There was a stationary front or a stalled out weather front across the lower Great Lakes near the thumb of Michigan, just to the north of our viewing area. And then on the backside of this, a very, very potent cold front. That was a trifecta of ingredients when you factor in the boundaries with this stationary front, this cold front, and being in that warm sector south and east of the low. Now, the evening of June 5th, after the morning round of thunderstorms, we saw ample instability in the atmosphere. A very hot and humid setting occurred, and we saw a lot of wind shear south and east of that low, and that facilitated what we call supercell thunderstorms. So as opposed to a multicellular storm structure, supercells tend to travel very far, and one single cell can drop a number of tornadoes. So that's what meteorologists were keeping an eye on, is within this warm sector, there were supercells that had a history of producing tornadoes and sadly traveled a significant distance and some of those tornadoes traveled 8 to 10 miles, as we saw with that Lake Township tornado. So I do want to zoom in on the map here and show you that storm path on the evening of June 5th of 2010. So we're going to start off in Wood County and work towards Ottawa County as the journey of that tornado touched down. So it touched down near I-80 and Oregon Road east of Perrysburg, moving through Moline, and then Lake High School. It was at an EF3 intensity. That is one of the most significant impacts that was felt on that evening. But as I showed you during those photos, it was not actually at peak intensity when it touched down at Lake High School. It reached that peak intensity of an EF4 strength in Millbury, and wind speeds were in the ballpark of 170 to 175 miles per hour when that storm ravaged Millbury. It proceeded to move east into Ottawa County, and it lifted off the ground near Clay Center as it finally started to weaken. The overall voyage of this tornado was in the vicinity of 8 to 10 miles, approximated by surveys from the National Weather Service Cleveland office. Essentially, the days after the storm, they are doing meteorological detective work, looking at the damage, looking at the photos, and looking to assess how strong of a tornado this may have been. Now, additionally, there were other tornadoes that touched down. Perhaps you weren't affected by the EF4, but you may have been affected by some of these other ones. In addition to that Wood and Ottawa County tornado, I do want to talk about the Lucas County, Fulton County, and also to the north of the state line, how southern Michigan will remember that night. In addition to the EF4, there was an EF2 that caused significant impacts to Fulton County, and there was also an EF1 near White House, fairly close to Oak Openings Preserve Metro Park. Now, north of the state line, another pair of tornadoes. There was an EF2 that essentially crossed US 23 near Dundee, Michigan, even did some damage to the Cabela's up there. And in Lenawee County, there was an EF1. This one was to the north and northwest of Adrian. Now, even though those twisters were not as strong as that EF4, perhaps they affected you, your family, your friends, with Dundee and Lenawee County also seeing some significant impacts overnight from the 5th into the 6th of June. Now, the impacts were devastating, not only in terms of the lives that were lost, but also the damages as well. There were approximately $102 million in damages and financial costs incurred, and there were 7 fatalities from that twister. 5 happened on the site and 2 in the subsequent days. And that makes this one the deadliest tornado in Buckeye State history since the 31st of May of 1985. So calling this a generational tornado is not hyperbole. This is the type of twister that you only deal with once every few decades in Ohio. 15 years ago, we remember this EF4 tornado, as well as the other tornadoes that impacted northwest Ohio and southeastern Michigan. And I do want to go over a few of the other storm statistics and some of the information that the damage survey from the National Weather Service yielded. It was on the ground for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, 7 fatalities. It had a width of 400 yards and winds up to 175 miles an hour. So in addition to having a strong velocity, it was very, very wide. Imagine 4 football fields wide, and that is the size of this EF4 twister. In addition to the 7 fatalities, there were at least 28 injuries that occurred, with $102 million in damage. It was on the ground for over 10 minutes and traveled approximately 8 to 10 miles, starting to the east of Perrysburg and moving to the east into Ottawa County. 170 to 175 mile per hour wind speeds were achieved at the peak, but as you saw through some of those photos, it wasn't just the EF4 damage that was notable. Even that entire trajectory of the storm, including the Lake High School damage as an EF3, and even some of the EF1 and EF2 damage, it doesn't necessarily take a super strong tornado to devastate lives and cause damage to property. It was also the size of this tornado that was notable, 3 to 4 football fields in width, and there were additional tornadoes in Fulton and Lucas counties, as well as north of the state line, where there were twisters that touched down in Lenawee and Monroe County. Here's a look at the tornadoes across the country that occurred as well. 53 total tornadoes from that outbreak occurred. So it wasn't just locally that saw those impacts, but also across a good portion of the United States. That June to 5th to 6th tornado outbreak affected a number of those states. As I pointed out on the weather map, that warm sector to the southeast of the low, as that cold front barreled through on the backside of it, that was responsible for a number of tornadoes nationwide that caused caused some significant impacts. But that EF4 here at home in Wood and Ottawa County, that was actually the strongest tornado nationwide from that entire outbreak. So if you're watching this on WTOL 11 Plus on social media, let us know in the comments, how will you remember that Lake Township tornado 15 years later, as well as any of the storm damage that may have affected you on that day. We'll have more on WTOL 11 News, online, and on WTOL 11 Plus. Take care.